Well, welcome back, everybody. And for those just joining us, greetings to you too as we begin session 3 of our Pathologies of Faith Forum. I'm your host, Peter Maravelis, and on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the University of California Press and Yale University Press, I would like to thank you for joining us today. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. It is, of course, an honor and privilege to be able to do so. This session is called Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. We'll be joined by award-winning journalist Jonathan Rauch. Jonathan Rauch is a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution and a contributing writer for The Atlantic. He is a recipient of a National Magazine Award. His books include The Constitution of Knowledge, The Happiness Curve, and Gay Marriage. He makes his home in Northern Virginia. His book associated with this session is called Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy, published by Yale University Press. In this session, Mr. Rauch asked the question, why has the crisis of Christianity become a crisis for democracy? He addresses the secular Americans who think Christianity can be abandoned and Christian Americans who blame secular culture for their grievances and argues that the two must work together if we are able to confront our present crisis. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Jonathan Rauch. Thank you so much for joining us. It is really an honor to have you with us, and welcome to this forum.
I am very, very happy to be here. Thank you. City Lights is legendary in my life. I still remember my high school English teacher talking about Lawrence Ferlinghetti and City Lights, and I did some of my growing up in the Bay Area. And so this is kind of a thrill for me, actually. I'm a little bit nervous and gobsmacked. So I'm going to talk a bit about my book, and what I'm going to try to do is show you some images and some videos and stuff like that. And in order to do that, I need to be able to share my screen. So let's see if we can make that happen. So that's my book cover. It's published in February by Yale. This is the most improbable book that I have ever written because I am an atheist and I am gay and I am Jewish. And yes, you can be all those things. They are in some tension, but you can be all those things if you're not too obnoxious about it. I am very much an outsider to Christianity. And I'm someone who, being gay and Jewish and atheistic, and knowing or intuiting at least all of those things about myself from a young age, like 5 and 6, I'm a very strange person to write this book. I grew up with a bad attitude toward Christianity because it seemed to me that it was cruel and hypocritical and bigoted. And I was not wrong about that, especially as relates to homosexuality, and especially in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up. And I tried at one point to believe in God when I was 14 at a Jewish summer camp. I went to Hebrew school and synagogue and got bar mitzvah and all that, but I never could believe. I tried at one point. It just didn't make any sense to me. Kind of a big daddy in the sky who creates this whole vast cosmos and yet is busy micromanaging the affairs of humans. It just didn't make any sense to me. My attitude began to change when I was 18 and was paired with a college roommate who was the first real Christian I met, meaning that he didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. He wasn't a plaster saint. He was funny and sarcastic and could get angry, but his name was Mark McIntosh. He went on to become one of the country's most prominent Episcopal theologians, priests, and writers. But Mark's whole life was infused with Christianity in a very positive way, and that was my first inkling. This might not just all be a scam. Nonetheless, however, let's see if I can advance these slides. Nonetheless, in May of 2003, in The Atlantic, I wrote the dumbest thing that I've ever written, and that includes my 2015 article, also in The Atlantic, firmly predicting that Donald Trump would never be president. This was an article, it's called Let It Be. You can see it here. It celebrates what I called tongue-in-cheek apatheism. It's theism plus apathy. And it said, isn't it a great thing that people no longer really care very much about religion? It's not that they're all atheists or militantly secular. They just don't care anymore. I said, I believe that the rise of apatheism is to be celebrated as nothing less than a major civilizational advance. Religion remains the most divisive and volatile of social forces. Apatheism is not a lapse, it is an achievement. If that sounds a little bit smug to you, that's pretty much how it sounds to me now. What I was, however, right about was that in 2003, we were at the front end of what may be the single most important social trend in America, at least of the 21st century. And that is a dramatic wave of secularization and something close to the collapse of white Protestantism. Now, white Protestantism, it's our founding religion. It's the Puritans and the Calvinists and Methodists and all those people who came over. And it's long been a pillar of American society. But here's what we see start to happen in just the past couple of decades. This is the number of people, who never attend religious services. And that's the red line that you see there. And it just about doubles from about 45 million to about 85 million. That's 40 million people in the course of, only 14 years. That's more people leaving the church in that short period, than entered during all three of America's great awakenings. Here is another metric. There are lots more, but I'll give you a few. You'll get a taste. This is the Gallup poll. Do you happen to be a member of a church, synagogue, or mosque? This is one of the oldest questions that pollsters have asked. It goes back to the very beginning of polling, and what you see there is right through 2000, through the whole 20th century, more or less 70% of the public is a member of a church, synagogue, or mosque. And of course, this being America, we're talking overwhelmingly about church. It maybe sags a little bit in the 80s and 90s, but look at what happens in 2000. Over the course of 20 years, it drops by 23 percentage points from 70% to 47%. This is 2020, 5 years ago. Only a minority of Americans were a member of a church. Where were they going? This is Pew Research data. Now it's the same period, this time 2007 to 21. Once again, we're talking about only 14 years. Very short period of time. The percentage of people who identify as Christians drops from 78% to 63%. For those who don't have their calculators handy, that is a 15-point drop over the course of 14 years, 1 percentage point a year. And I'm telling you, folks, that's seismic by the standards of social change on a basic variable. And where are they going? That's the gray line. A 13-point increase in the share of people who have no religion. These is the so-called nones, N-O-N-E-S, the people who are just outside of the religious sphere. There's lots more data like this, and it all shows pretty much the same thing, although the very latest data from Pew that just came out suggests maybe that the flight from Christianity may have plateaued, may have bottomed out. Hasn't reversed, but it may have bottomed out. So I was pretty smug about all this. I thought, religion's divisive, dogmatic, brings out the worst in people, we'll be better off without it. Here's the part I was wrong about. All kinds of indicators of well-being went south over the same period. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of reasons for that. I don't believe in monocausality. You had cell phones and social media and maybe parental overprotectiveness and, the crash of 2008. So, take all of that. But everyone who's looked at it believes that an important variable is this: the collapse of Christianity, and with it, the communal life, the church life that went with it. And you can see here, there's tons of figures like this. You've all seen them all, but I've just pulled a few, almost at random from the Surgeon General's report on loneliness and isolation. Now, again, this is the very same period we've been talking about, first 2 decades of the century. Social isolation goes up, social engagement with friends and others goes down, companionship goes down. Here's another one that you've seen. This is mental health not good, days per month. This is stuff like depression and anxiety. It goes up for every group during this period, but look at especially what happens in the last 10 or so years for depression and anxiety, and look at those 18 to 25-year-olds. That's the youngest group. That is a sad variable. There's another side of this. Besides the social indicators like loneliness and anxiety and lack of connection, there's something else, and this is where I come in. I'm not a mental health person, but I work in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, and we sit around all day and worry about politics and the country's governability and things like, does Congress work and do elections work, and can we still even have a country where we can deal with each other? And I came to believe that America is becoming ungovernable in some significant part because of the failure of Christianity. So one of the things that I forgot or neglected in 2003, or maybe just didn't believe at the time, is something that the founders told us about. So they said they could give us a constitution and a structure for government, but they also said this structure won't work unless we have a population that has what they called Republican virtue. And by that, they meant things that in our terms would be things like civility and toleration, being well-informed about civic life, truthfulness, lawfulness, and so forth. And they said, well, here are some of the things they said. Adams famously, we have no government armed with power capable of containing human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. George Washington, from the famous farewell address, which was ghostwritten by Hamilton. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. Madison, now we don't really know much about his religious faith because he never told us. But Madison says to suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a chimerical idea. It's a pronounced chimerical idea. So what the founders were not saying is that this has to be a Christian nation or you have to be a Christian to be a good or moral American. In fact, they specifically rejected that perspective. They were prevailed upon by the religious nationalists, Christian nationalists of their day, to include Christianity and Jesus in the founding documents. They refused to do that. They wanted ours to be a secular republic with a division between church and state. They believe in that, and I believe in that. Yet, at the same time, they also told us that the Constitution would not give us Republican virtue and that instead we would have to look to civil society to provide that. And by that, they meant, of course, family and community and the schools. But they also importantly meant Christianity, white Christianity, white Protestantism, the dominant form of Christianity in their time and still today. They assumed that Christianity would do the important jobs in a republic of inculcating the core virtues of how to live together, transmitting those virtues to the next generation, providing a transcendent sense of life, answering the key questions like, so why are we here? Providing a grounding for morality. They knew that that didn't come from the Constitution, but had to rest on a substrate of civil society. So they implicitly assigned that job to religion, to Christianity. And that's what they're telling us here. So what then happens? as Christianity it starts to decline in the mainline churches in the latter half of the 20th century, but they are replaced by vibrant evangelical churches who are more sharp-edged and countercultural and more rooted in Scripture. But then they too go into a sharp decline in the 21st century. White evangelicalism begins to cave in. And now today, according to Pew, only 13% of Americans are members of mainline churches, and only 13% are members of evangelical churches, pretty small minorities. It turns out that when Christianity fades into the background, other things take its place. And one of those things is hyperpartisanship. People increasingly look to political party, for the source of who they are, what is my tribe, what am I doing, what is my meaning in life, and what is right and wrong. And that leads to the rise of the kinds of numbers you see here. This is Pew data. It refers to what political scientists call affective polarization. There's policy polarization. That's what we all grew up with. If you're my age, that's, taxes, raise them or lower them, abortion, good or bad, homosexuality, foreign policy. You can compromise over that stuff or you can work it out. Affective polarization is when the two sides hate and fear each other. In other words, I really don't know that I can share the country with those terrible people. And here you see, again, we're talking about the same period, though this starts in 2016, so it's a bit complicated by the rise of Trump and MAGA and all that, but you see the trend there. Each side saying the other is closed-minded, dishonest, immoral. I mean, those numbers are, again, huge. It's an almost, among Republicans for dishonest and immoral, it's what is that, a 25 or so, 27 or so % increase. This makes a country very hard to govern. And then something else that happens, it's not only that we increasingly bring sort of religious zeal to our politics, it flows in the other direction too, because the white evangelical church increasingly becomes politicized. And here you see, this is a quote from Ryan Burge, who is the country's leading religious demographer today. I urge you to explore his Substack if you're interested in these issues. Here's how he says the white evangelical church has changed. He says, evangelicalism used to be a term that denoted a certain adherence to a specific, I need to move my screen, theology and active engagement in a Protestant community. Now, evangelicalism just means I am a conservative Republican. It's become little more than a cultural marker and has little to do with any type of religious devotion to the teachings of Jesus Christ. And that's very true. If you've ever explored Christian nationalism, a complicated phenomenon, one of the things that scholars say about it is it is political, not secular, and you'll hear very little of actual scriptural discussion and talk about Jesus Christ. And here are some signs of this. This is evangelicals' alignment with Republicans, the Republican Party over the last, what is this, about 28 years, I guess, 27 years. And again, look what happens in this same period of the 21st century. You see Republicans going from about 60% leaning Republican to almost 80% leaning Republican, and that is a strong consensus. Here is the presidential vote among white evangelicals. Now they're conservative, so they're going to lean Republican, and they did for many years. But again, starting in this century and really consolidating in the Trump era, 2016, 20, and now it's not on the chart, but 2024, same thing. You get 80+% voting Republican. I think it was 82 in the most recent election. This is Ryan Burge's data. This is an interesting one. It's a little hard to explain, but people are asked, position yourself ideologically on issues, conservative, liberal, that kind of thing, and also position your perception of the two political parties on those issues. And you can see the results. The gray line is where people place themselves, and the other two lines are where they place Democrats and Republicans. And you'll see here that among Christian groups, self-identified Christian groups, one does not look like any of the others. There is no distinction at all between where right evangelicals place themselves politically and where they place the Republican Party. Interestingly, if you look at the lower right, at members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you see they break with Republicans, not wildly, they're still very conservative, but they distinguish themselves markedly from Republicans starting in 2016. Ask yourself, well, what happened in 2016? You probably know the answer. So, what happened to the church in the course of its realignment with Republicans? So now you're going to hear, God willing, a clip from a speech that Donald Trump gave toward the beginning of his 26 campaign at Dordt College. That's an evangelical college in Iowa. It's white evangelical audience. You will probably have heard both of the things that you will now hear him say. What you may not know is that he said these two things in the same speech, a few minutes apart. So I will now attempt to play them for you.
Christianity will have power without having to form, because if I'm there, you're going to have plenty of power. You don't need anybody else. You're going to have somebody representing you very, very well. Remember that. I have the most loyal people. Did you ever see that? Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.
So you've heard the quote about Fifth Avenue and shooting people. And you may have heard the quote about, if I'm in office, you will have power. Remember that. What's he doing there? Well, Matthew 4:9. Let's go to the gospel. Jesus has been baptized and he is preparing to launch his ministry by going into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. And there he encounters Satan, who tempts him by taking him to the highest mountain in all the land and showing him all of human dominion and saying, all these things I will give you if you fall down and worship me. What's the deal he's offering? He's saying I will give you power. Remember that. And in exchange, you will give me unconditional loyalty. Power for loyalty. As you all know, if you remember your Bible, Jesus rejects the deal. He says, go away, Satan, get thee behind me. And that's the foundation of his whole ministry. The Christian church, unlike Judaism, unlike Muslim, is not a state religion. It's a countercultural religion. It distinguishes this world from the next world and says its business is with the next life, not the next election. But white Protestants have a different view. They accept the deal that Trump offers them, at first a bit reluctantly, but then very soon they become the most energetic and enthusiastic part of Trump's base. In fact, Trump would handily have lost the last election, if not for that solid 82% white evangelical support. Now, they will say, and there's something to this, that look, we have a policy agenda and Trump gives us important things that we want, especially the overturning of Roe v. Wade. There is something to that. However, for a church, there is likely a price to be paid if it abandons its core theology in a search for power. And here is a very well-known example of that. This is Donald Trump Jr. speaking to the Turning Point Action Convention back in, I forget the date, but here we go.
We've been playing T-ball for half a century, while they're playing hardball and cheating, right? We've turned the other cheek, and I understand sort of the biblical reference. I understand the mentality. But it's gotten us nothing, okay? It's gotten us nothing.
Turn the other cheek. It's gotten us nothing. Thinking about this for a moment, that guy Jesus, what did his ministry get him? I mean, he died like a slave, tortured on a cross. I mean, what a dummy. He got nothing. You see here a pretty strong departure from anything that resembles Christianity. It's much more like paganism. And you see here, as a result of this, a change in the character of the church. And part of that is a change in its view of character. This is one of the better known polling results of this century. This is from the Public Religion Research Institute. It asked people if an elected official who commits an immoral act in their personal life can still behave ethically and fulfill their duties in their public and professional life. In other words, can you be a person of poor character and still be a good political leader? In 2011, among Americans, Christians, white evangelical Protestants were the group who said the character matters the most. They were the least number that said a person of bad character could be a good leader. In 2016, they flip, and boy, did they flip. 72% now say you can have poor character and be a good leader. They are now the least character sensitive of any denomination in America. Now, once again, ask yourself what happened in 2016. Here's another example of the kind of thing that we see. This is a question that PRRI's president, a guy named Robbie Jones, said he never even expected he'd have to ask, because he always thought Americans would just reject the premise of the question. But he asks is, do you agree that immigrants entering the country illegally today are poisoning the blood of our country? Clearly not a very Christ-like way to talk, if you remember Christ's attitude toward the poor, the stranger, the immigrant, and so forth. And you see there's only one group, one religious group, in which a solid majority of people agree with the sentiment that immigrants poison the blood. It's white evangelical Protestants, and you see that is, once again, identical to the share of Republicans saying the same thing. So it turns out that the bargain that white evangelicals made with partisan politics was that they gambled that they could influence partisan politics more than partisan politics would influence them, and that's a gamble that they lost. So white Protestantism increasingly became partisan, politicized, and secular. And you know what? If you want to do politics, you can do that without giving up your Sunday morning. And so people who are following Jesus leave the church, drift off. Many of them become nuns and disaffected. And other people enter the church who are there to do politics, changing the nature of the church and changing the nature of Christian witness. This is Russell Moore, the editor of Christianity Today, former senior official with the Southern Baptist Convention. He's become a friend and a mentor in this work of mine, and I strongly recommend his book, Losing Our Religion, an altar call to American Christians. Here's some of the things he says. The frantic rage we can often display in supposedly protecting Christian values might feel like strength, but the world sees it for what it is: fear, anxiety, and lack of confidence. They can also see that it's nothing like the confident tranquility of Jesus. That sense of paralyzing fear can also fuel the loss of the next generation. If the only choices we offer are secularization and paganization, we shouldn't be surprised that they choose one or the other. If the only choices we offer are secularization and paganization, we shouldn't be surprised that they choose one or the other. So here I am, the non-Christian, bemoaning the fact that the church has turned away in many respects from its own teachings, at least in public life, in civil life. And that's an important distinction. Another big light bulb in writing this book came when I heard what you're about to hear. This is John Ward. He's a Christian, a journalist. He wrote a wonderful book called Testimony: Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation. His father was an evangelical preacher. He's a former evangelical. He's now Catholic. But here's something that he said.
One of the conclusions I've come to in writing the book that I've finished recently is just that a lot of evangelical churches do a pretty good job of discipling their members in private virtue or private character within the family. Yes, there have been scandals and leadership scandals and abuse scandals, but I think broadly evangelicals are virtuous people in their homes and in their local communities, but they have not been discipled in how to exercise public character.
Public character. So what he's talking about there is what you might call a civic theology. Evangelicals have a term, it's called discipleship or spiritual formation. And that's the process of making oneself, one's life, and one's thinking and one's actions, one's deeds, making oneself in the image of Jesus. And they're pretty good about that in the local community, in the family, in the church. You know, when there's hurricane comes, the churches are going to be there. But there's really nothing in church teaching in the white evangelical church about how to disciple people, how to build character, what Jesus would want people to be like in their civic life, meaning especially social media and politics. And that's led to a problem, and it's very piquantly summarized by David French, who's an evangelical and a writer, in this conversation that he had with Russell Moore.
The fruit of the Spirit are not just tactics to be deployed to win people over. They're the markers of who we are, okay? And then the last thing I'll say is you cannot go into the political world and say, you know I'm a bit of an asshole on Twitter, but you should see me in the soup kitchen. And that's just not the way it works. You can't cabin off parts of your life.
Christianity's meant to be a whole garment. It's meant to infuse how Christians function in their whole lives, including their political lives. So the question becomes, is there an implicit, or for that matter, explicit civic theology in the teachings of Jesus? Something that would help fill this gap and explain what it is that Jesus would want his followers to do when they're on social media and politics. And the answer is yes. And then the answer is, it turns out that the teachings of Jesus in this regard are very close in spirit to the teachings of James Madison and the founders of our liberal order. So let's just go through them very quickly. I mean, there's a lot that can be said about this because it's very profound stuff. I'll mention this is all from Christians. They all agree that these 3 points are essential pillars of Christianity, defining pillars. Some say, well, you need to add repentance there. But these are the big 3. Don't be afraid. The most frequently repeated injunction in the Christian Bible. Some say the whole Bible. Believe that God has a plan for you and that it's good. Don't go around in a state of existential fear, or you will make bad decisions and you will be cruel and inhumane and panicked. Second, imitate Jesus. Be like Jesus. Now, Jesus' ministry is radical in a couple of ways. First, he's a radical egalitarian. He believes in the fundamental equal worth and dignity of every human individual, including the weakest, the poorest, the sickest, the most marginal. That's who he ministers to. And going along with that, Jesus says you judge a society, you judge a Christian, not by how well they treat the rich and powerful, but how well they treat the least among us. A radical, radical idea in the development of human ethics. And third, forgive each other. Judgment, retribution are the province of God, not the province of man. Forgiveness is very difficult, and yet we practice it if we're Christians. So those translate very directly, very nicely onto the core premises of liberal democracy. Don't be afraid translates to share power. Sometimes you're going to lose an election. Don't treat it like the end of the world, like an apocalyptic loss. Don't panic. Don't try to lie or steal the election. You'll be out of power for a little while and part of the government, and then you'll have an opportunity to come back stronger than ever and learn from your mistakes. That's how it's supposed to work, not fear. Second, imitate Jesus. That translates to those core values of liberalism that we see from the founders of liberalism, John Locke and Immanuel Kant, all the way up to John Rawls, liberal theorist today. Core of the liberal idea is all people are born free and equal. I mean liberal here not in the modern sense of left-wing progressive, but in the sense of the founding fathers and the Constitution. All people are born free and equal. It's that very same egalitarian doctrine. And the other thing that distinguishes liberalism is that there's some things that no state power can ever do. No tyrant can do it. No majority can do these things, abusing minority rights, that those rights are inherent in every individual. That's, of course, the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, right out of the gospel. Third, forgive each other. That translates to pluralism and toleration. Sometimes you win an election, and when you do, the goal is not to crush the other side or, drive them out of society and salt the soil with the tears of their women and children. The goal is to share the country. Yes, you'll get some of your policy preferences, but you're going to treat the other side the way you want to be treated when they're in power. And otherwise, you cannot run a liberal democracy. Forgiveness, in what Christians call forgiveness, is very much like what liberal theory calls forbearance. You're not out to do the worst thing, to treat your fellow citizens, even despite political differences, as your enemy. They're not your enemy. They're people you disagree with. So one of the motivators for this book is I looked around and said, who is doing the work of civic theology? Who is actually working to try to embody the ideas of Jesus Christ and embody those in how they'd be in politics? And an inspiration for this book is a speech that Dallin Oaks gave in November 2021. He is the first counselor in the first presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He's number 2 in the church, probably will be the prophet in the not too distant future. He's also, it turns out, a former judge, Utah State Supreme Court Justice, president of Brigham Young University, University of Chicago law graduate, very distinguished lawyer. But this is a speech he gave in 2021. It's one of quite a number of speeches given by him and the church's president, Russell Nelson, and others. And here's what he says. He says in this speech, I come to you not as a lawyer, but as an apostle of Jesus Christ. And here's what he says.
We've always had to work through serious political conflicts, but today too many approach that task as if their preferred outcome must entirely prevail over all others, even in our pluralistic society. Both religious and secular rule are ordained of God for the good of his children. Reconciling adverse positions through respectful negotiations is a virtue. The experience of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints suggests that a way can be found to reconcile divine and human law through patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation.
Patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation. That's how they believe Jesus Christ wants us to approach the world of politics. That's rooted deep in the theology of the church, going back to their version of the story of the Garden of Eden. And it's not just what they're saying, it's what they're doing. I am a gay American. I am married to a man. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believes homosexuality is a sin, and you can get excommunicated in their church for same-sex marriage. Nonetheless, this church on 2 occasions in 2015 and 2022 were among the leaders of landmark laws that extended rights and privileges and protections to gay Americans, along with, at the same time, additional protections for religious liberty, so that both sides are better able to go about their lives without conflicting with each other. My marriage, because of the Respect for Marriage Act, which their church helped put through, my marriage is now secure in federal law, even if the Supreme Court overturns it. And their church and all other churches in that same law are protected from the government weaponizing tax breaks, nonprofit status, contracts, and grants to force a church to agree with same-sex marriage. This is an example of not giving up on your core premises, but of what theorists of conflict call deconflicting, which is expanding the space for people to live their lives and get along while maintaining their values. Now, I realize that not many Christians are going to become Mormons, and I'm certainly not. And the point is not that you have to agree with Latter-day Saint theology or become a church member I'm just suggesting that Christians can take inspiration from the kind of thinking that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is doing about what would Jesus want Christians to embody, to exhibit in politics. And I'm also saying, if they do that work, they will find right there in the Gospels, in the teachings of Jesus, the three principles that they need, that our liberal democracy also needs. You don't have to be a believer in the divinity of Jesus Christ to believe that on those three principles, he was right, and that we need more of them, not less of them. And I'm glad to say that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are not the only people who worship Jesus Christ who are doing this work. We're seeing here some of the groups that are beginning to work out civic theology and answer the question, so what is a Christ-like attitude toward politics? This is not about what does Christ think is the right policy outcome. This is about the how of politics, as Curtis Chang puts it. This is about in what spirit do you approach people in politics, especially when they disagree with you. Here are a handful of the groups that are working on this. Michael Ware of the Center for Christianity and Public Life published last year a wonderful book called The Spirit of Our Politics, which is on this topic. So the good news is that Christians have begun to realize that there has been this giant hole for civic theology, and that hole has created an opportunity for some of the worst of secular culture to come into the church and corrupt it. And they want to push it out again by building a civic theology. And my hope is that they succeed. You know, this is the least likely thing I'd ever do, this book. You know, here I am, I'm very secular, and I'm an atheist and a Jew and a gay, you know, and here I am telling Christians that I'm not suggesting that they become more conservative or progressive or Republican or Democratic or secular or anything else, except that they become more Christian, and that they move away from the kind of politicized partisan politics that we have seen in the church over the past few years, and move toward bringing to the church and to our society more of the teachings of Jesus for the betterment of both. So I will stop there, and I will stop screen sharing, and hopefully have a conversation with all of you.
So as we're waiting for the questions to come in, you mentioned that Christianity is a kind of a countercultural religion. I mean, in this critical moment, do you think we may have the making of a more civil Christian Reformation in this country? I know it might be maybe imperceptible or very subtle. There might be a possibility for a movement that rejects Satan's temptation, as you said earlier, and it embraces virtue, empathy, forbearance.
Well, I can certainly say that's the hope. I can tell you that there are some signs of green shoots, though still very early, but it looks like Gen Z is interested in Christianity and in participating and in church life. And it looks like, as I mentioned earlier, the latest data suggests that the flight from Christianity may have abated and may have plateaued. And when as Gen Z comes in, it's going to change the church. You know, it won't be like our grandparents' churches, you know, or their grandparents' churches, I should say, you know, the cathedrals and the mega churches. It's going to be more personalized and more customized and more about lifestyle. But what Russell Moore says is that we're not going to see like a giant schism and an apocalyptic contest between the MAGA church and the anti-MAGA church. That the way Christianity revives itself historically is from the grassroots up. So you'll begin to see this new group of younger people, not just younger people, but people who are dissatisfied with the direction of the church, begin doing church plantings. You'll see new generations of pastors. You'll see it in the small groups. Those are the Bible studies and other groups that are really the core of evangelical life. And then that you'd see it in the teaching. I don't honestly know yet, Peter, if that's going to happen or not. And alas, it's not up to me. I'm not a believer. It's up to Christians. I can tell you that I've polled my audiences, and I've said, how many of you are Christian? And virtually everyone, you know, a lot of people raised their hand. And then I say, okay, keep your hand up if you think the church has taken a wrong turn. And most of them keep their hand up. Then I say, okay, now keep your hand up if you think the church can change and improve and address these issues. And once again, most people keep their hand up. So Christians aren't giving up. I can tell you that.
Yeah. Jonathan Rauch, really want to offer you City Lights' gratitude and much appreciative. This was a wonderful, wonderful presentation, and I look forward to your, participation in the next session. I also want to thank Christian Purdy and Elizabeth Pelton over at Yale University Press for helping make this session a possibility. And finally, thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us and sticking with us throughout. We have, of course, posted links in the chat function, actually for a variety of different things, including Mr. Rauch's website and many of the references that he made. And also, of course, you may purchase copies of Cross Purposes. Today's event, of course, is being made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our publishing program, and our educational outreach. That is, of course, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So we're going to be taking a short 10-minute break. Then we're going to join you again for the closing session. So hope to see you all in a bit.